Hello and welcome to SONNETCAST, William Shakespeare's sonnets recited, revealed and relived. I am Sebastian Michael, and this is a special edition about the first 17 sonnets of the collection, which are known as the Procreation Sonnets. So in this episode we are not actually going to recite any sonnets or reveal anything particularly about them individually. We are simply going to summarise what the first 17 sonnets are about and what makes them so special and what we have gleaned from these 17 sonnets so far. Next regular episode will then therefore be about the incredibly famous and often recited and particularly gorgeous sonnet 18, but that's the next regular episode. This is the special episode about the Procreation Sonnets. Now, the Procreation Sonnets are something of a conundrum. They are entirely clear in their intention, in their message, and in their poetic purpose, and yet they seem to fit nowhere properly. I say seem because many things are not entirely as they seem when it comes to William Shakespeare's sonnets. And so, more than anything else, and more than many, if not most, of the other sonnets that we have of William Shakespeare's, they raise the question, why? Why does William Shakespeare at some point in his life take time out of what cannot have been anything other than a busy schedule to tell a young man to produce an heir? What concern is the young man of his? That he is doing this, that he is writing these sonnets specifically to tell a young man to get on with it, get married, produce an heir, is beyond doubt. This is just absolutely clear, and we can all agree on this. But why? And, of course, who is this young man? And, incidentally, the assumption that William Shakespeare's schedule is, by the time he writes these sonnets, busy, is one we can consider reasonably justified, going by the sheer volume of his output during the, by our standards, comparatively short 30-odd years of his adult life. So, just to reiterate this one more time, there is virtually no question as to what these first 17 sonnets in the traditionally accepted and originally published sequence are about. They, without doubt, and with hardly any exception, exhort a young man to get married and have children. The only semi-valid exceptions are Sonnet 5, which simply doesn't stand alone but sets up the argument to be concluded in Sonnet 6, and Sonnet 15, which also does not on its own make an argument for procreation but appears to offer an alternative way for the young recipient to perpetuate his memory beyond death, namely the poetry of Shakespeare himself. But unlike the astonishingly famous Sonnet 18 and its immediate successor Sonnet 19, which both absolutely postulate that the poetry itself will make the young man live forever, Sonnet 15 in fact only sets up Sonnet 16, which suggests that there is a mightier way for the young man to safeguard his existence, namely making a child. Which is why 15 and 16, much as 5 and 6, also belong together as a pair. Now, some people surmise that Shakespeare may have addressed the Procreation Sonnets to his nephew, but not only is there absolutely no evidence of this being the case, it is also really highly unlikely. William was the oldest son of his parents and the oldest child to survive into adulthood, and so it would have fallen to him to continue the family line. His younger brother Gilbert died childless and unmarried. His sister Joan did have several children, through whom there are people traceable today who are in fact related to Shakespeare, and his youngest brother Edmund had a son, Edward, who would be the only nephew who in theory would seem a possible candidate. Except he was nowhere near prominent or important enough to warrant anyone going to such lengths to try to convince him of the need to produce an heir, especially not in these terms. As we know, nothing can be said with certainty, because everything is conjecture except the words. But here, in summary, is what the words themselves tell us about the recipient of these first 17 Procreation Sonnets. It is a young man. Thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, among many other references, and the fact that he is being urged to have a son, that fresh blood which youngly thou bestowest, your day of youth. These are just a few of the many very clear pointers we have that we are talking to a young man. This young man is obstinate in his refusal to marry. The existence of the whole sequence itself suggests as much, as do direct references such as "Why lovest thou that which thou receivest not gladly?" to name but this one from Sonnet 8. We also know that the young man is beautiful. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die, is the first line, or the first couple of lines rather, of the first sonnet in the sequence. You would not say such a thing to somebody who was not himself considered beautiful. Or then being asked where all thy beauty lies in Sonnet 2, thy unused beauty must be tuned with thee in Sonnet 4, thy beauty again in 12, that beauty which you hold in lease, Sonnet 13. There is no doubt, then, that the person we are talking to is considered to be beautiful. He is also somewhat narcissistic. Thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, in Sonnet 1, or for having traffic with thyself alone, Sonnet 4, and this may go as far as being somewhat prone to sexual self-sufficiency, consumest thyself in single life, and such murderous shame commits in Sonnet 9. The young man, and this is why a relative of Shakespeare's, such as his nephew Edward, simply does not really feature as a candidate here, the young man is in the eyes of the world and has his admirers. Thy youth's proud livery so gazed on now, and he is considered beautiful by the people around him, the lovely gaze where every eye doth dwell, and Sonnet 7, more or less in its entirety, which compares the young man to the sun rising in the morning, and everybody looking at the sun for as long as it is on its ascent, and then losing interest once it descends in the evening. The contrast also to every private widow in Sonnet 9, thou art beloved of many in Sonnet 10. So we are in very little doubt about the young man being of status, of stature. He is known by the world. People consider him to be important. He is a desirable, eligible bachelor, for where is she so fair, whose uneared room disdains the tillage of thy husbandry, in Sonnet 3, and many maiden gardens yet unset with virtuous wish would bear your living flowers, in Sonnet 16. We get a clear indication that at the very least William Shakespeare, but very possibly and very probably people around him generally, consider this young man to be a good catch. The young man is principally, if not indeed solely, responsible for the upkeep of his name, as is indicated, for example, by Sonnet 3, or who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love to stop posterity, or who lets so fair a house fall to decay. There's a reasonable argument to be made that if he weren't the only or oldest son, then the burden of responsibility to carry on his family name and to produce an heir that continues the line would not rest so heavily on his shoulders. The young man bears a striking, or at the very least noteworthy resemblance to his mother. Thou art thy mother's glass. We have noted in Sonnet 3 that this is not something you say to just any young man. Most young men would prefer to be compared to their father, most likely, especially in a very patriarchal society such as that of William Shakespeare of Elizabethan England in the late 16th, early 17th century. And the young man, apart from being beautiful and possibly somewhat petulant and narcissistic, is also lovely, and his presence is described as gracious and kind, though this may or may not, of course, be flattery on William Shakespeare's part. The young man, and this is quite a crucial nugget of information we glean from the sonnets themselves, no longer has his father. Dear my love, you know, you had a father, let your son say so. This is not something you say to a young man who has his father. It would be an insult supreme to do so. We know that the young man, at the time he receives these sonnets and is urged by Shakespeare to marry and have children, that he no longer has his father. Very little, if any, in fact we can say nothing of this points towards a known relative of Shakespeare's. All of it, without exception, applies to one particular young nobleman whom we may as well name now, Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton. He is not, I hasten to add, because I am, as a podcaster on William Shakespeare and his sonnets, duty-bound to do so, I hasten to add he is not the only candidate for the fair youth of William Shakespeare's sonnets, and we have no proof that even these first 17 Procreation Sonnets are addressed to him, but what we can establish with some degree of certainty is that every single point of those just listed applies to Henry Wriothesley. He was born on the 6th of October 1573, which makes him 11 years younger than William Shakespeare, who was born in April, probably around about St. George's Day, the 23rd, this is uncertain. We like to think that Shakespeare was born on the 23rd of April 1564. Now, we don't know when exactly Shakespeare writes these 17 or any other of his 154 sonnets, but we do know that they are first mentioned in 1598. It is therefore not only entirely possible, but likely that these sonnets were written some time before then. The 3rd Earl of Southampton was certainly young then. He turned 21 in 1594, and he was categorically unwilling to marry. Coming of age, and therefore into his inheritance, he paid the Lady Vere, whom he'd effectively been betrothed to, £5,000 not to marry her. That's roughly £3 million in today's money, or if you want to think in euros, that's roughly 3.5 million euros or dollars, thereabouts, in today's money, to not marry someone. And this is not just some random person we're talking about. This is the Lady Vere. Lady Vere is none other than the granddaughter of Lord Burleigh, who just happens to be the Lord High Treasurer of the Queen herself, and thus one of the most powerful men in the country. You have to be quite determined not to marry someone if your potential bride is the granddaughter of the man who effectively holds the power in the country, who has the confidence and trust of the Queen herself, who is after all a reigning monarch, and to pay that person off with a small fortune, or by most people's standards, you would probably argue, and I would agree with you, quite a big fortune. The 3-odd million pounds or so. Whether or not the 3rd Earl of Southampton was beautiful is probably mostly a matter of taste, but there is little doubt that he was considered beautiful, not least by himself, that he had admirers, and that, as an immensely rich young aristocrat, he was a tremendous catch. He is the only son of his parents, Henry Wriothesley, the second Earl of Southampton, and Mary Wriothesley. He does, as a young man, absolutely bear a striking resemblance to his mother, and crucially, his father is no longer alive. The second Earl of Southampton dies in 1581, when Henry, his son, is aged 8. And the person who becomes responsible for raising him is Lord Burleigh, the Lord High Treasurer to the Queen, one of the most powerful men in the country, who then wants to marry him off to his granddaughter. None of this proves anything. We simply do not know whether the Procreation Sonnets, which are the first 17 of the Fair Youth Sonnets, are written for and addressed to Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton. But it is possible and plausible, so as not to say likely. He, of all the people we know of who could be considered candidates, fits the description. And what we also do know is that in 1593 William Shakespeare dedicates his long narrative poem Venus and Adonis to the young Earl of Southampton, and 1 year later, in 1594, he follows this with another, by some margin more effusive dedication in the second of his narrative poems, The Rape of Lucrece, which simply means that there clearly is a connection of some sort between the two by the mid-1590s. The other person who sometimes, in fact frequently, gets mentioned as a possible recipient of the Fair Youth Sonnets in general and the Procreation Sonnets in particular is William Herbert, the third Earl of Pembroke. He also refused several brides who were proposed to him, and he was certainly young when he was doing so. But while he does tick these two boxes, he does not match several others of the criteria that should be met. He may or may not have borne a resemblance to his mother as a young man, but we don't have any pictorial or other evidence that he did. He was a first but not an only son, and his father doesn't die until 1601. This is still 3 years before he himself then finally does marry, aged 24, and so it is possible that William Shakespeare, having written several sonnets earlier, is tasked sometime between 1601 and 1604 to write these sonnets to the young William Herbert, not least because it is also possible, though not certain, that William Shakespeare in the 1590s was working with and for the Earl of Pembroke's men, a theatre company the second Earl of Pembroke and father to William Herbert was patron of. So a connection between the Pembroke family and Shakespeare may indeed also have existed. Whether it is Henry Wriothesley or William Herbert or some other person who might have had these 17 sonnets written for him, the question still remains, why? And while we don't know the answer to this either, at least not for certain, the most plausible explanation, and one that readily makes sense, is that Shakespeare was simply commissioned to do so by somebody who sought to urge the young man to take on his responsibilities and secure the continuation of his bloodline. Who this might be is open entirely to speculation, and this to an extent where it would be imprudent here to make any suggestions, since any that we can make are almost entirely unfounded. There is no document that points to anyone, with one single exception: the publication of the sonnets themselves. This carries a famous and intensely debated dedication, and it is possible, though not at all certain, that this dedication points to the person who initiated some or many, though almost certainly not all, of these sonnets. But that is for another special episode, because it merits discussing in some considerable and considered detail. Suffice it to say, for now, that while we know nothing for certain, and everything is conjecture except the words themselves actually draw a fairly individual picture, and it would not be in the least unlikely or unusual for a concerned relative, such as a mother or a friend of the family, to employ a working poet to write some poetry to prod the unruly heir to the family's title to do the right thing and get married so as to produce a son and future heir. At the same time, there is almost no other plausible reason we can think of why William Shakespeare would have written these particular sonnets, and so I am inclined to reiterate, in the absence of certainty, likelihood is our friend, and the most likely explanation for the existence of the Procreation Sonnets, to my mind, is that William Shakespeare was commissioned to write them for the very rich, very beautiful, and exceptionally reluctant to marry Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. Overall, the way the words characterize the recipient of these 17 sonnets seems to favour him somewhat, though not absolutely. But of course, the Procreation Sonnets do not stand in isolation. We noted as we were listening to them how they appear to chart a trajectory, and we shall notice how this trajectory yields quite naturally and almost seamlessly into the sonnets that follow. And this will become a critical factor in drawing any conclusion as to who the young man might be, because these next few sonnets contain some extraordinarily revealing clues as to whom they are addressed to, and if there is any likelihood at all that that is the same person as the recipient of these Procreation Sonnets, then we shall get much, much closer to the identity of the fair youth. And of course, there will be a special episode about the fair youth, much as there will be a special episode about the dedication in the 1609 quarto edition. But most importantly, of course, there will be many more episodes on the individual sonnets, and the next sonnet in the sequence as we have it is the glorious sonnet 18, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And so I hope you will join me again here on SONNETCAST as we recite, reveal and relive the sonnets of William Shakespeare.